Well, welcome. It's good to see you all. It's hard to believe we've been in school for 7 weeks now. So for those of you who aren't currently attending the School of Architecture, I'm Mark Robbins. I'm the Dean of the school. And I welcome you to our annual Werner Seligman lecture. This is one of my favorite lectures. It gives me the chance to think about the changing of seasons and time. And I think this is the 8th Seligman lecture that we've had during my time here. I'd also like to recognize Jean Seligman, who is with us tonight in the audience, and who I'm very, very pleased to see, who comes from Cortland with Janet Stack, a friend. And this is the first time that we've had a landscape architect, Julia is happy, give the Seligman lecture. Though, if you remember, we did have Weissman Freddy lecture, and they are architects that certainly work with landscape and look at the intersection of landscape form with urbanism. And Walter, in fact, if I can be this revealing, is in fact trained as an architect before his training at Berkeley as a landscape architect. And so for the brief bio bit, Walter teaches at Berkeley and was the chair for about 4 years. I think it was 1998 to 2002. And he established his Oakland-based firm called Hood Design in 1992. And this is a multidisciplinary design firm that does landscape projects, urbanism, art projects, installation. So it's actually quite broad. And this goes from earlier projects like those in Lafayette Square, to the recent De Young Museum, to the California African American Museum in Los Angeles, and a new sculpture terrace at the Jackson Museum of Wildlife Art in Jackson, Wyoming. Also, for those of you in Buffalo, there's an installation in Buffalo using 1.1 megawatt photovoltaic array. So this is new work that I haven't seen and look forward to seeing perhaps tonight. He's a recipient of the National Design Award from the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, and he was named by Fast Company as a Master of Design. So it's quite a bio. Walter and I met, what is now 15 years ago, which, yeah, floored me too, at the American Academy in Rome. And I have great memories of wandering around through what I think Walter used to call pejoratively Baroque architecture. So all that stuff. So I think dragging him at first reluctantly through Il Gesù. But I remember a trip that we took to Barcelona, where, as I recall, I lost a wallet. And Walter got mistaken repeatedly for a soccer player, a Brazilian soccer player, which did nothing for my evening at all. And Walter did much better by that. And so if you can imagine the scene, we're on the kind of AstroTurf roof of a shopping center at the edge of Barcelona with these intense artificial lights. And maybe it was the Caipirinhas, I'm not sure. Or maybe it was getting out of dinner at 2 in the morning, or this kind of surreal juxtaposition of the end of the Ramblas, the waterfront, shopping, intense social life, and this bizarre artificially generated light that made me think about the multiplicity of cities, or the ways in which cities are remarkably porous places. And I think landscape architects have always been aware of this kind of porosity, always. And I think Walter's practice is unique because he focuses in on some of the most common kind of daily aspects of the way we use space, the way we occupy space. The splash pad park, for instance, thinking about the rituals involved with washing cars or taking care of the kids. and thinking about space, which is both gendered, but also has physical properties and physical qualities. All of these can be brought to bear in the making of architecture and landscape architecture. And then I think at the other end of the spectrum, the work for Herzog de Meuron at the De Young Museum, where beautifully articulated shards of gardens sit in the midst of the Herzog de Meuron radically torqued geometry in Golden Gate Park. Long after Rome, and by the way, Walter had the best studio at the Academy with a great terrace overlooking the city. He was very, very popular, not just because of the terrace. And he would make these watercolors of landscapes, the landscapes that he was looking at, buildings, Tuscan-colored buildings with cedars, always about the horizon line, always about the sky, and always about these cedars. Walter decided, not surprisingly, to return to school in a way and became an artist in residence at the Art Institute to pursue with greater intensity his own artistic work and sculptural work, the kinds of things he had explored in installations like the Project Row houses, in which these beds made out of kind of slats that looked like hockey sticks, bent wood, which were kind of a remarkable presence, as I recall, probably with the wrong juxtaposition in these very, very long spaces. So just last week I was in a taxi in that kind of distracted space that you're in cabs looking at your cell phone, and I heard this familiar voice I hadn't heard in a while. And I looked up and it was Walter's face. And I guess USA Channel has a program called Character Approved. And it's a group of people who design or make art or invent things who make a difference in the world. And so there's this kind of great array of people and kind of talking heads on the promo. And then I look up and there's Walter, and he's talking about architecture and landscape architecture. And he quoted one of his mentors saying, we're only called in when we need change. And when we change something, we transform it. And this for me is what we do as landscape architects, as architects, is we transform things and we make spaces for activities where they didn't exist before. It's my pleasure to have Walter join us in that other Italian city, Syracuse. Walter.
I should just let Mark give the lecture, right? How's that? Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good to see a packed house. It's my first time in Syracuse. It's taken that long. How long have you been, Dean? 8. Yeah, it's taken that long.
It was an MG that interceded in the last
Okay.
time you spoke.
It's a pleasure to be here. Tonight I'd like to spend about an hour talking about this title that I've entitled Public Sculpture, but it's much more personal of a journey for me. And as Mark sort of said, the last 6 years I've been engaged in what I would call art practice. And I was asked to go to the Art Institute by Mary Jane Jacobs, who's a really good friend, curator, and we were doing some work down in Spoleto, and she said, why don't you just come and hang out in Chicago? I'm like, I teach full-time, Mary Jane. She goes, there's airplanes. So we set up this program, and for 2 years I basically spent 4 semesters going back and forth to the Art Institute. And what was really fantastic for someone as old as myself, because I've been practicing for 20-some years, been teaching for 20-some years, to go back to school and to be in that setting was really fantastic. And for one purpose, it took me out of the practice and professional context. And it put me in a context of artists who, you know, your best friends, the artists, they're always thinking of something that can't be imagined or done, right? They're just out there. But they have this certain sort of proximity or way of being in the world that I was very critical of myself as a professional, that at times I was not in the world. I was in the practice. And so for 5 years, they helped me, and I would say they, lots of people, helped me cultivate what I call a cultural practice. And again, being trained as an architect, landscape architect, urbanist, an artist, how do you bring all those things together? And at the end of the day for me, as I was writing my thesis last semester, it's really about people. It's really about place, and it's really about time, and how we interact within that context. That's really what it's about. And then we leave this planet, we become mulch, and we leave something behind, right? And that then grows, and the next generation has that conversation. So for me, my work is not dichotomized as he's a landscape architect, he's this, he's that. I'm someone who finds a context in which to work. And the context at times is very different. But you have to be able to have a voice, I think, to be able to communicate to people within this context. So I'm going to take you through a myriad of projects tonight, and I'll try not to go really fast, but there are a lot of images. And I did this intentionally so that you can kind of see, hopefully, that there is this common sort of string, which is the question that begins. And then where we end up is always someplace different. With each one of these, I'd like to tell a little story because as culture, it really helps to locate the genesis of the idea. A friend of mine, Mitch, is flipping $1 million houses in San Francisco. Mitch invented the park horse, or one of the park horses, you know, these exercise things. And that's how we got to know each other. And he asked me to design this garden. And his garden looks towards the bay. It has a view of the Bay Bridge. And he wanted to get rid of that foreground stuff and just sort of isolate the bridge. And so we built this new sort of railing that consists of redwood trees that probably was never there, but it's a conversation about the forest behind you and now the bay in front of you. On the other side, a windy site to the house. We then talk about fog and redwood trees and the ferns, and everything is in motion on this side, and this is the entry. But these little projects like this for me help to sort of locate place and constantly remind myself of the Bay Area. The Bay Area, I'm constantly flying back and forth and I'm never there. And these projects really help to ground me. So having projects locally allow me to sort of look closer at that place. On the other side of the coast, Charleston, South Carolina, is a place that I wasn't too familiar with. I'm from North Carolina. In the South, North Carolinians call South Carolinians Geechees. And for years, I didn't know why we call them Geechees. We would just say, you're from South Carolina, you're a Geechee, right? They ate rice. You know, 20, 30 years later, I have a chance to do a project at Spoleto where we went in search of water. And it turned out that Geechee actually meant Gullah, and Gullah Geechee, which are still Africans who've maintained their cultural sort of practices and patterns and practices along the coast from North Carolina all the way to Florida. So we a few artists set out to talk to people who live by the water who didn't have any kind of economic sort of dynamic within the changing landscape. And this is Mosquito Beach on the left, and this is looking at the Citadel from the other side. We bought 350 IKEA blue chairs, put them in a van, went out, set them out in the landscape, and then people started to talk to us. And things we learned on the left, back in 1969, there was a shrimp boat queen, African-American woman, who actually was the first shrimper in South Carolina. She got invited to Ghana to teach them how to shrimp. It was published in Ebony magazine. We would have never found that out without the blue chairs, right? So ways of learning about place, just the act of making. Who's been to Charleston, right? When you go to Charleston, it's hard to find the water, right? Charleston is a neck that sticks out there. You have to go all the way through the city, over all this hard surfaces, and then you get to the water, and then there's marsh, right? There's really no water. But actually, Charleston, for the king and the slaves, it became this billion-dollar industry between the colonists having the seeds and the Africans having the know-how to move water. So for 5 months, we grew Carolina gold rice in these courtyards and actually brought water back into the city. But again, it talked about a place and a time. And within a couple of weeks, there were frogs, there were blue herrings circling around. And if you ever get caught in a rainstorm in Charleston, move your car, because the water will rise. And so this idea that we live in places that we don't see them. And again, through the art of making, we can make people aware. And at the end of this installation, Ernesto Pujo, an artist out of New York, we christened this new rice garden right next to Meminger Theater by Huff and Gooden. But the idea of making people sort of aware of their surroundings is not a new one. When we go out to shop, when we go out for a walk, we look around and we can actually find our cultural heritage. At the Oakland Museum, for their new grand opening, we decided to talk about canned spinach. And it's not about pie, right? But it's about really getting the people of Oakland to really consider their heritage in a different way. The Oakland Museum was one of the first public museums in this country. Before the Panthers took over Oakland, it was actually going to be free. But its opening was at the same time that the Panthers were on trial across the way. So they closed it up, and by the time the trial ended and the museum opened, they had to actually start charging because they were afraid, right, of the public. So this idea of how do you bring the kind of the private in was through canned spinach. And Del Monte Canning used to actually be in Oakland, and so we were making this kind of parody on industry, agriculture, and for me, I was really pushing at this very pastiche sort of critique or notion of urban agriculture today. In every city today, when you look at a poor neighborhood, everybody wants them to grow their own food. Urban agriculture has been around since this country began. Urbanism has agrarian roots. A lot of people who've come from the agrarian areas to our cities, they still practice cultivation. So in a way, what we're beginning to say is, what we're saying with this project is the garden or growing food is something that needs to be in a museum. And this is just Walter's take. Yeah? And then part of that, we also christened the entryway into the Spanish and Asian sort of collection by taking two sort of pieces from the Alhambra, and I think this is from the Gardens of Kyoto, and turning them upside down, suspending them in a Dan Kiley and roach vitrine, which the plants never grew, and actually created these kaleidoscope landscapes. About 90 miles away in Sonoma, the eucalyptus trees are being eradicated. And so we decided to take all of their cuttings and actually create a soliloquy. And this soliloquy allows something human-made to actually attach itself and connect to something that I find really beautiful, which is this about 50-year conversation between Australia and California. In Gardens of the Gods, ecological historians posit the time period that during the late 18th century, early 19th century, Australia and California literally exchanged flora with one another, and they actually thought that they could create the same paradise on two different continents. And so we have the eucalyptus that's left, but since the firestorm of 91, we're now getting rid of all of them. So the soliloquy sort of is this sort of activism by the eucalyptus tree saying, I'm a beautiful specimen. Look what I can do. I can give you light, and at 12 o'clock during the day, I can give you sound. And as the air comes through, the leaves talk to one another. Thus, we get the soliloquy. And everything in this garden is made of eucalyptus, from the ground to the vertical surface. So on one hand, these kind of temporary pieces for me give you a chance to do something really fast and to say something, maybe to have a larger conversation. But then there's the permanence. And about 7 years ago, I read this quote by Carl Andre, who said, a road is a piece of sculpture because you can actually walk on all sides. And I started thinking, wow, isn't the public environment full of dead sculpture just waiting to be awakened? So if you take a typical city street lights, hydrants, curb and gutter, all the objects that we put there that are just so mundane, we spend a lot of money on that stuff. And then on top of that, we put the nice stuff. And that's cheaper than the first stuff. And so now a part of our practice is taking the mundane, these street lights, bus shelters and all of that, and activating them. This is a bus shelter in front of the West Oakland BART station. And it was done with an environmental justice grant. And what we tried to, or are attempting to say here, is that this public sculpture is for the ordinary person. Going to catch a bus, going to catch a train, what's around you is made in an artful way. This is a set of lights, roof pattern that basically rise up to the scale of this freeway, which has disconnected this community. And when you're under, it provides shadow, but it also provides just a different way to interpret that urban landscape. And then looking back, it rises up and it gives scale to a landscape where people have been diminished because of infrastructure. At the other end, one of the residents kept coming to the meeting and saying, Walter, I need a gateway structure. And I was like, well, we don't really have the budget. He goes, I need the 5 M's. And he kept saying, you got to have Martin Luther King, you got to have Malcolm X, you got to have Maya Angelou present over the street. And he started giving me these drawings. So one day I'm going to San Francisco and I notice at the toll booth, there's this huge truss and it says red light, green light, and you're waiting. To hold all the Caltrans signs, there's a 7-foot high truss structure behind it. And it's got M's, right? So I was like, 5 M's. So I go to the meeting and I gave him the 5 M's. This is the fabrication. This is Martin. This is 8 feet tall. And this will go over a 120-foot freeway. And there is 5 faces. And these are faces of Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, Maya Angelou, who used to live in the neighborhood, a local jazz queen who used to run the jazz club, and did I say Malcolm X? And Malcolm X, yeah. And this is being fabricated by the same people who actually provide the trusses for Caltrans. And the irony is we tried to get them to bid on the project in the beginning, and Caltrans has an exclusive contract with these guys. By the time we got into fabrication, the people who fabricated it bid on our job, and I actually got to go to the graveyard of Caltrans to actually pick up all this stuff. So it all works out in the end. And lastly, to grace the entry will be these 30-foot tall dancing light pieces that remind you of big hip women in clubs who turn and the slits of their dress come up and the light will pour out. Yeah? And these are being fabricated and these will be in front of the BART station. So the collection of these everyday objects begins to say that just the tube steel that we use for lights and other things, we can animate them, we can still get light, but we can also get presence. And this street is I guess, it wasn't not known to us when we designed this. 10 years earlier, we were asked by the Museum of Modern Art to reveal something about a particular landscape. And this was part of Revelatory Landscapes, Aaron Betsky's final project before he left MoMA. And this landscape was striking to me because, one, BART had come in, and in most places where BART is our light rail or our subway system, where it goes through most of the affluent neighborhoods, it's underground, and poor neighborhoods, it's above ground. And it kills neighborhoods when it goes above ground because it's like you're in Disneyland and there's this like thing floating through and it's very noisy. And so our piece was, let's put mirrors on the BART to show what it did to the community. Because most people just walked by and didn't look at the community, they actually looked at the BART side. And so as a way of activating or deactivating the columns, we were able to then get people to see the decay that was actually happening because of the infrastructure through their everyday practice. And then I had my students take a typical park bench and just proliferate that in a place where a church once stood. And then we talked about that history in reference to the piece. And this was right before 9/11. And after the events of 9/11, we had to take all of this out of the public realm because it was part of the post office. And in turn, years later, the community came back and advocated for money to do something on the street because they remembered this project. So I showed it to you in reverse. This next project Mark mentioned, the new DeYoung Museum in Golden Gate Park. If you've been to Golden Gate Park, it's not like Central Park. It wasn't designed by Olmsted. Most people think it was. Actually, Olmsted wanted the park to be downtown, going the other way where the prevailing winds actually protected you. So he wanted to do a promenade. And of course, those people who own land out here at the west, they were like, yeah, right. See you later, Mr. Olmsted. We want a park, because it was a big development piece. And so by putting the park here, the city just moved westward. Now this was all sand dunes. So they had to take all that sand out and bring all this new dirt in. But most people who go to the Young Museum or to the park, they think it's natural. But again, it's from that same cultural landscape that was developed late 19th century. So for us, it was really about trying to get people to see artifice. And the architects had already created this box that had this kind of increased tension to it. That when the De Young was built, people were jarred because they remembered this old neoclassical thing. People left notes when they tore it down. Oh, my good friend, I will miss you. Right? So when the new friend came to town, it's like, ah, right? And so in a way, the landscape became this foil for the building. And it became a way to remember landscapes that people had never seen before. Like this view was never visible because the Asian Museum sat right here. And we were able to find the same trees that they planted in the tea garden, and we put them in the space where the Asian was, and so people thought that this had been there all along, right? Or in the front, one of my older colleagues, Fran Village, right before he passed away, just sent me letters and letters and letters saying, Walter, why did you plant those palm trees? They're not native. These palm trees have been here for 110 years. But again, this landscape, no one looked at the palms because they looked at the building. The palm trees were just part of that landscape. And so being able to save these trees, which took over $1 million for the client, it sits on top of a parking garage, we took them away, we cleaned them up and brought them back. It gave a setting for the architecture to manifest. And it allowed that conversation to continue. And that's one of the things I learned very early in design, is this kind of disruption, right? The erasure of place is very jarring to culture. The best way to get rid of a group of people, to erase them, right? And so we know about the urban bulldozers of the 60s and 70s, but we still have urban bulldozers today. Every site we start with, we erase it, and we cart it off somewhere. But this notion of palimpsest is something that here in America we can build upon. And so for us, we were very interested in this idea, right? Getting the ground to look like, well, maybe it's been there for 100 years or 1,000 years. Or getting people to look at things in a more critical way. Like these ferns that are part of a fern grove, which is about 2 blocks away, that was given to the park by Australia, I think Sydney. They gave these giant tree ferns. We put them in the middle of the museum. So every plant around within a quarter mile of the museum, we just bring them to the museum. And so people see them in a completely different way and a different context. And hopefully, when they go back to the park, they have a register, right, of understanding artifice, that it's not something natural. And at the end of the day at the De Young, this has become a major destination place. And it's not because of the landscape, it's because of the architecture, it's also because of what's gone on with the development in the park. But the De Young Museum, over the last 5 years, 2 million people per year trek across the entire San Francisco landscape to get there. There's no good public transportation. I mean, it's not like you can just go to MoMA or something. You have to make an effort. But now they have Friday nights, young people have discos, people have their birthday parties here, and people just go for picnic. So this idea that the landscape, again, can bear memory, but could also say something about who we are and who we want to be. I think the De Young Museum bears witness to that. And then at times we can say things about, things that we forget about, whether it's flora or whether it's the weather. We can talk about it in different ways. And I was out here one day, and this guy sounded like he was from Canada. I don't know where he was from. He's like, yeah, these people are crazy in San Francisco. They make fog. They have fog, and they make fog. But this idea that, again, we can forget. And every time the fog machine comes on, I don't know where the children are hiding, they appear. And it's just one of those things. Again, how can you begin to sort of build upon the locus of the environmental condition? And here's that view of the tea garden where the Asians sat. And you can sort of see these maples popping over the fence, the terrace being excavated here. And that edge condition here, which was once a building, now we allow that landscape to sort of flow over the edge. And one of my sort of favorite pieces of this place is how when you're in the museum, the park and the garden merge together in a kind of a kinship, that you're not quite sure where one begins and the other ends. And for us, we were looking at the picturesque, looking at these Eastern gardens for ways of thinking about how one diminishes proximity as well as boundary. And I think particularly from this gallery looking out towards the west, you have that feeling. And this is one of my favorite things about just objects in the landscape. And most landscape architects know this. You get a client, you put benches down, they go immediately. Put things on the benches so people don't sleep. We forget what other people do on benches, right? We have that mindset of someone's going to sleep versus the kid dancing. I mean, I watched this girl. She was just like danced for hours. But she was a ballerina, you know? And again, being able to have, you know, a circumstance where that might manifest. This next project is Splash Pad Park. Mark mentioned it. This is this beautiful sort of shot of the Bay Area where there's Lake Merritt located in the middle. And Lake Merritt is actually tied to the estuary. So it's actually a confluence of the creeks that come through. This project I'm talking about is not that beautiful thing there. It's this little thing right here. This freeway is Freeway 880. When it was built in the 60s, it actually won an award because it's making this huge span. There's a span from here to here. And I guess it's one of the longest spanning sort of bridges in the Bay Area, which who knew? As we were doing the project, there was a plaque underneath it, buried, you know, to the engineers, right? So we brought it out and we put it in a nice place. But this is that space as well. And this is what people, again, don't see. They see the freeway versus being able to see the small micro space. There's a market here every Saturday. It's the largest market in the East Bay. And it happens under a freeway. And it happens, I think, because we never said, let's hide the freeway. We basically said what the space was. It's a space under a freeway. And people in the neighborhood understand that. And when the market first started happening, the San Francisco Chronicle was like, can you believe those people in Oakland? They're eating food from under the freeway. You know? But if you look around the Bay, everybody's eating food from under a freeway. Because freeways are everywhere. So it depends on how you look at the context. But again, the interesting thing here, people park under the freeway, they walk out. We did these little 4-foot pathways, and it takes you through the market and to commercial areas. So it allows for you to have this kind of grand sort of connection back through. And all the geometry and everything is based on the freeway because the freeway won the award. So we figured, you know, you got to base everything on the freeway. But this has now become the center of this neighborhood. And I don't think you could take this little piece of land away from the landscape because people would probably go crazy. There's a website now, Splash Pad Park. There's tango lessons. There's markets. There's massage. I mean, you get it all right here. Lafayette Square Park, as Mark mentioned, is one of our first projects. Again, a relationship with a set of transients who lived in this neighborhood over 30 years. This large-scale composition actually allowed this same sort of use to happen. This is in the 30s and 40s, mixed use of guys hanging out, selling something, lying about stuff, and you can actually get your hair cut there today. The same guys, not the same guys, but guys are there out of work, telling lies, selling you stuff, and it still happens. And the thing that worked for us was when we redeveloped the space, we did one piece at a time. We did one half of it, people stayed. We then opened up the other half, let them come in, take it over, and then did the other half. It took longer, but they actually took care of the space. And today when you go there, and if you like sit on a table or something, someone will call you out. And this ownership actually develops through this relationship, right? And as my friend Randy Hester says every time he goes here, even people pushing carts like this look good in this space, right? And it's because the space is not designed for people who push these carts. And this is something, again, that we're very quick to fall prey to. We see a person in a circumstance, and we will design to that circumstance versus designing to the possibilities, right? Giving water, giving electricity, etc. Macon, Georgia, 320 cars parked on 3 blocks. People just didn't want to give up the car. And we created a set of yards. And this is in middle Georgia. It was a pretty traumatic time for me. This was right after Rome. The South is still the South. I was actually black-faced in the local club once we won this competition. But for us, it was really about 2 things. One about, there's a Daughters of the Confederacy obelisk right here. These are bales of cotton. It's really about getting people to kind of understand that exchange without having to say anything. And on opening day, this woman comes up to me, these look like bales of cotton. I was like, yeah, they're bales of cotton. So you get it, you know? But then on the way, you know, we found that their water source was actually this creek that was underground. And that there was this 80-inch pipe made of clay that I didn't want to touch, right, that ran underground. So we pumped a lot of the water up to allow people to actually see it. 80 San Jose. The entryway into San Jose, if you've been to the new airport, is fantastic. If you've been to downtown, it's fantastic. San Jose was the fastest growing city in Northern California in the 80s and 90s. And it still has probably one of the best public art programs and development programs in the Bay Area. We were asked to look at this 15-acre cloverleaf and to say, could you make an entry into San Jose? And this is the perfect California project. You're on the road and you're moving 70 miles an hour. What better thing to do, right? The previous designers had Pete Walker did the master plan for the area, and of course he went back to the agrarian nature, and so it was very Pete lines, right? Someone came in and did a design, and they put tractors out in the middle. And of course, the mayor was like, we're not putting tractors out there. So we won the project, and we started having these meetings, and people wanted to express the natural landscape, but they also wanted to reinforce the agrarian history. And for some reason, that just gets us, right, to reinforce agriculture. And so we developed a plan that was basically going to be a dramatic grid. And I was really intrigued by driving through the grid, right, orchards, wineries, etc. And so we came up with this idea of mixing tech and agriculture together. So that comes out to be this notion of the bells. Of course, in my Italian memory, right, the bells coming down the hill, and then these giant coils of wire, fiber optics or whatever. And could you sort of create a dialogue between these 2 aesthetics? And so we started cutting holes into these big pipes. And the idea was to set them in this 15-acre freeway and then have people move around them. And so also what's really great is this is the flyway into the airport. So people flying in would actually say, wow, is those agricultural fields? But when you're in the Porsche or the BMW driving around, you just see these hoops. And these hoops are constantly changing as you move around, depending on how fast you go. And I was really interested in this notion that these things were static, and that as you move around, you get different views of them depending on where you're going. And it's not built yet, and this might be because the way this guy is driving. But this idea that during the day and during the night, there would be something different that one sort of understands about your arrival into San Jose. And this is part of the entry into the airport as well as the entry into the downtown. Flying in as you're coming in, these pieces just kind of floating. This next project is down in the University of Virginia. And I don't have to get into the sort of description for architects, landscape architects, of Jefferson's nice little sort of campus here. But we were working on the project a decade ago with Polshek and partners, and the South Campus was born. And this notion of extending the lawn south became the fascination, I think, of donors as well as the campus, because the campus needs to grow. But how do you create that formality? And if you know the story, well, I don't know if everyone knows the story, but at one point in time, that access was open. And that Jefferson really had the library on one end, and you looked out to this amazing vista. But then the McKim Mead and White building came in. Some people say it came in because of this place at the end of it named Canada. And you look at images from the time, it's basically where the help was actually putting the clothing, washing the clothes, doing the chores for the boys in the school. It became unsightly. And what do we do with unsightly things? We block it out. And so the access was closed. And so to make the new access, they needed a bridge. And therefore, the South Campus was born. On the way, the South Lawn was born. On the way to that, though, they actually ran across some human remains. And they had to stop the project. And it turned out to be a cultural landscape in the end that Cheryl Barton and I advocated for because it belonged to an African-American free black slave who actually owned the land and actually took care of the boys. And so there was a story that began to unfold. She got her PhD and the information became more clear that this was actually a homestead. And as I talked about with Canada before, it reached not only here, but it reached easterly across Charlottesville. And we think it's called Canada because when the Emancipation Proclamation, blacks were able to live in this one area. They thus named it Canada because of Canada being free, which is kind of smart, huh? So I was really intrigued by this notion of how do you document a landscape where there was very little left other than kind of the ruins. And I was reading Vlach and Upton's book about Behind the Big House and this notion of, African Americans circumventing the classical nature of the plantation. It was ripe for this project, right? So I drew squiggle lines all over it, went and presented it, and people in UVA just went, "You must be out of your mind. We're not doing squiggle lines all over the place." So the idea was to break that classical architecture and to give a much more residential, a much more informal feel. So in the end, we kept the precinct over to the right, and we put in a different scale, a scale of a homestead, which is defined by a frame, but most of the remains are below ground. The place of internment, in this area, the ground or the geology is very porous, so the remains, as the bodies decompose, the ground actually slumps. And so you actually see these beautiful field sort of works. And then the notion of the shadow catcher, and this idea of the spirit. And again, being Southern, being influenced through Southern mythologies. I was really fascinated by Ferris Thompson's critique of flash of the spirit. If you go to a lot of Southern cemeteries, you'll find a lot of shiny things on graves. And he talks about the flashes when the body's interned and the spirit is rising, it can't get to heaven without a ride. And so as soon as the sun hits the reflection, there's a spark and the spirit goes to heaven, right? So this idea for me, though, was could you have the spark, but could you also have the incongruity or the ambiguity of where the site is? Because if you go to a site, an archaeological site, you don't really know where things are. You're trying to estimate where things are. So the shadow really creates this moving sort of picture. So it's a kind of an inversion of Venturi's piece in Pennsylvania. And so here's that precinct separating the art history school from our site. The scale all of a sudden shifts. There's a lot of interpretation that talks about what's underfoot. And this was done by a great team of people that were put together by the project team. And then you actually come into the site and you actually see the pathway that led up to the house, which has this amazing stonework that was done by local carpenters and masons. And then you have the frame, but the first thing you see is the shadow. And the shadow begins to suggest that there is something different than the brick rows that you see around you. And it begins to talk about this kind of temporal relationship. Then you look up and you see something shining, and it reflects the sky. And so there's a constant looking down, looking up, down, looking up as you move through. One of the greatest compliments, I was in Pennsylvania last fall at a garden show speaking for a friend, and this white couple came up to me and said, "Thank you, Mr. Hood." And I was like, "For what?" "We're from Charlottesville." And they said, "Thank you for allowing us to have a conversation," which I thought was just really wonderful. The place of internment, as I said, is just pretty much a groundwork. And the groundwork, again, begins to talk about that there's something there. We don't really quite know what it is. And the pathways, the small pathways that allow you to sort of meet the person as you're coming along, unlike the other pathways on campus. And then the piece de resistance, when you're having your Starbucks coffee, you're looking out, the student center is up here. What you see is actually a place of internment. And for me, the power comes in that being part of the ordinary, right? It's not something that's been sort of pushed to the side, but it's that piece that's there all the time. And following the blogs on campus and hearing some of the students talk about this, the first day it went up, this one student was like, have you seen this really crazy looking thing over by the South Lawn? Da, 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 da. And then like a couple days later, I went by that thing. You know what that is? That's a blah, 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 blah. And he just goes on. He goes, you must, he starts talking about this history. And so every day students get to pass through something that's a little richer, right, than just the TJ story. It's a little more than just that story. And so when you go to new places on campus, for me, they lack that, right? Again, the palimpsest. How do we build that back in to our practice? Find the Rivers, Mark mentioned, is this project in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is a 1,000-acre project. And this image actually sets the tone for the entire project. This is looking out probably about a 20-mile radius around 3 rivers. Downtown is right here. Right? Schley Park, these large 19th century suburbs, you can kind of see these big things. Look at that big green thing in the middle, though. This is not a 19th century suburb. This is a working class neighborhood. It's the Hill District. It's where people don't go because it's the Hill, right? And for us, this became a place where we worked. Some people call Pittsburgh a shrinking city. Some people call the Hill District a place of disinvestment. Some people call it an African-American enclave. Some people call it a poor area. Some people call it a place where drugs are sold and you don't want to go. I mean, it's got all of those sort of connotations like we might want to put to a Cleveland and Detroit, et cetera. But for us, we were hired by the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy to help them find the river. And that was part of their project. And I told Susan Rademacher, the head of the Parks Conservancy, I said, well, let's ask that question later. Let's try to find out a little bit more about the Hill. The first thing that turns out, the Hill is a series of hills. And we started talking to people, and of course they started saying the hills that they lived in, not the singular, but the plural. It's also an amazing sort of urban history sort of project where one can learn about, like most African American and immigrant neighborhoods in this country, by the 20s they were amazing. They were places where we had this diversity that no one wants to talk about. West Oakland, when West Oakland first started in California, Italians, Portuguese, African Americans. When our neighborhoods, Harlem, when they were like amazing, they were the most diverse places. It's when they became separate, black, or whatever, that's when the economic base fell, because all of a sudden you only have one group that's buying from you. You want that sort of multidimensional group. And so the Hill, like most places by the mid-century, public housing was being built inside because pretty much the diversity had changed. And it was becoming a ghetto, a group where only one group of people were living. But in hindsight, thank God for that public housing, because look at those big patches that they built upon. Now, Pittsburgh is a series of bluffs. So at each one of these edges, there's probably like an 80-foot or 100-foot drop down to the river. And again, the story of the circulation and the infrastructure and how it killed a city. And really quickly, we took the neighbors through a process that tried to reimagine their neighborhood again. And we tried to find things that were more, more part of their patterns and practices, like the stairs. And then we came up with a process to basically make the Hill District a suburb, a 21st century suburb, because everybody wants to move to the suburbs, right? And so we basically just flipped the script and said, you don't have to leave. You don't have to go to Schley Park. You already have the suburb. And so we basically sampled all the suburbs around, and we showed them in a comparative way that you got more stuff than them. Your architecture might be bad, but history knows the architecture is going to go away, and the landscape is always going to be there. They have proximity. 5 minutes, you can walk downtown. They have access to the river, access to all kinds of things. But for most people living there, they want to go to Schley Park. They want to go out to the suburb. This has the highest biomass within the area. And so we took them through the whole thing of saying, you live in the woods, love the woods, right? Woods are great. Then make a village and have a conveyance system to deal with your water issues, and everyone will want to live here. And then we took them through a process of how to make the woods. And you make the woods through all of the things you have now. And the idea was to not bring in anything new, but just to dust off all the things and literally allow them to come together to formulate a new idea about how we can live in cities, particularly where ecologies are so dynamic that probably here, this is one of the places that needs to be less dense. Because if we go back to that first image, the rivers shape this area, and the water is still running through this area. And you probably don't want it to be the highest density, meaning spread out, but more focused. And at the end of this process, I was invited back to the Hill District. We have the inverted Central Park, the donut in the middle. And I go into the meeting, and the director of the nonprofit says, here's Mr. Hood, he's from Berkeley, and he's going to present us our woods, our village, and our conveyance. And my job was done because they had already begun to see it. Because once you see it, then it's there. It's already imagined. And these kids, the first day I was out there, my first experience was this overgrown, weed-infested lot, and someone going, hey, you, come on in here. And I'm like, you must be out of your mind, you know? And this kid here comes running out, and he grabs my hand, takes me in, and immediately I was 12 years old. You know, I mean, doesn't exist anymore. I was 12. They were sliding down this hill on these weeds with these cardboard boxes. They were like swinging from it was amazing, right? And so we then took people on a trail, a walk. This was the final project. It was not a presentation in a room. We met on a Saturday. We gave people yellow ribbon. We walked the Coal Seam Trail, which exists. And then we labeled the Coal Seam Trail, which exists. And then we cleaned the stairs off. Then we walked down the main artery, spray painting old uses on the street. Now, of course, as we're doing this, people are going, what the hell are you doing? Like these guys here are asking, but before we know it, it's like the Pied Piper. People are following us, literally watching as we paint, and we ended up at the police station. And the police station is the famous precinct of Hill Street Blues, right? You guys, there's people old enough to know that, right? And Hill Street Blues was this amazing 80s detective drama, kind of like CSI, guys, for you young people. It's like CSI, but it had like really good actors. It had like the pizza man and the beautiful woman with the black hair, and they always drove up this street, going up a hill, and it was always snowing. That's the hill, right? And you walk into the precinct, and there's a guy there ready for roll call. Right? And so I asked him if we could put the banner on the building. And he's like, I don't know, you know? And of course, most of the cops are white. This is a primarily black neighborhood. So the sergeant who came in the afternoon was black. The person at the nonprofit knew her. He said, okay. We then put all of our drawings around the entire thing, tucked their parking lot, had a barbecue, and then called everybody in. When this first started, this brother comes up to me. He goes, excuse me, Mr. Hood, but I have to ask you, this is really wrong. We hate these people. You know, he went off on me, and I was like, why? He goes, the police, we hate them. You know, why are you doing this here? You know, and there was this other woman who I was trying to get her, she runs this market, I was trying to get her to do a plaza right here. She's like, I don't like this space, I don't like stand here. It has the best solar orientation. You can see the entire thing. It's at a place of 5 points, which has this mystical sort of relationship. But through the whole thing, everybody always talks about the hill being a scary place. What better place than next to the police station, right? And by the end of the barbecue, the police were talking to the residents, and the residents were talking to the police. And now this is going to be where the first public space is going to be located, right next to this space. On the way to this project, we were actually offered a public art project, and it was for the civic arena. And we decided to talk about the hill because the RFQ was for artists and a landscape architect to come in and to talk about redevelopment of the hill, but also how we could actually get lead points for this new arena by HOK Sports, which has a different name now. And so I was inspired by August Wilson. If you've ever seen an August Wilson play or read an August Wilson book or story, it's always the hill. Doesn't matter, it's always the hill, which I thought was beautiful. You can go around the world, all your stories is about the hill, right? And even in his plays, the backdrop, the prosceniums were the hill. And I thought, wouldn't that be great to bring the hill to a hockey stadium? And to actually make these curtains that would be 20 feet high. These are like 8 inches apiece. And we asked neighbors to bring us any image they had of the hill. And didn't care who you were. And this little red piece was going to ameliorate all of that damage, right? But we went with it anyway. And we made this beautiful rain garden, because rain gardens are cool, right? You guys know rain gardens, right? Rain gardens catch water. They're very green. They talk about our sustainable future and all of that, right? They don't talk about the land where people were there. And then the curtains kind of fall on the edge. And you go into a rain garden and you see the curtains. But the curtains are built up like these quilts over time. And we would ask people during the summer of last summer and the year before to bring the pictures, and we'd add up. We got the competition. They were like, you're never going to get the pictures, but this is a beautiful project with the rain garden. They saw this image and was like, thank God you're not going to get the pictures, because people are going to get beat up in here and all of those typical kind of things. This is all glass, okay? And so we started collecting images. The first barbecue, we had a line. People were bringing in big sacks of images, and it was like crazy. And of course, when someone brought an image, this is my Uncle Mark, and then they wanted to tell you about Uncle Mark. And it became this long thing. It's like, okay, we got to back up. So we got Pitt involved, we got Carnegie Mellon, and now we're trying to sort of create this archive. We also have access to Teenie Barnes, who was this amazing photographer in the area. But this is some of the images. Just beautiful, These guys are making out up on Sweetwater, which is the reservoir, which used to be the place where people hung out and the preachers used to go to. And we decided, we told them they should remake this landscape. But these places now are all derelict. There's August Wilson on the left. This is the Crawford Bar. This is where people would go and hear this amazing music, Lena Horne. Much later, the guitarist. God, all these people were from Pittsburgh. I never knew it. Pittsburgh was called the Chicago of the East. George Benson is from here as well. And this is Teenie Barnes' image of what those alleys used to look like. So what we decided to do was create the rain gardens, but then through this other history, is there a way to actually talk about that cultural realm? So within the rain gardens, when you go in, there'll actually be rain songs. And so we've been collecting rain songs. So rain songs, images, and flora will actually create these new experiences. And so when you go in each one, this music will come on really, really loud, and you'll look around, right? It's a rainy night in Georgia, right? This is Seal, but we'll probably sample as many artists who sing this, right? And you'll kind of come into this garden. And once you come around, the music will actually go and sense around, because most of them are circular. And you'll see the images because it's westerly. And they wrap around kind of in unison. And it's my hope that this kind of tertiary understanding of all three things create this zeitgeist, right? That somehow you get the rain garden. Because I don't know about you, I've seen a lot of rain gardens. As my friend says in Charleston, they're just ditches with nice plants. So hopefully the ditches with nice plants now will have music going on with it, and you'll have it going on. Yeah. This next project, I only have a couple more, so bear with me, is in San Francisco, and I sold out on this project. Audi called me, or Venables Bells called me, and the car manufacturer Audi wanted to give the city of San Francisco $1 million to actually do something on the street to actually brand the new A7 car, right? Never driven an Audi. But walking down Powell Street is amazing. If you've never been to Powell Street in San Francisco, the lower 2 blocks, on any given weekend day, 35,000 to 40,000 people moving through, which is New York on a typical day, right? But imagine that in San Francisco. But it's also where the trolley cars are running. It's also where this kind of very feminine architecture, I think of San Francisco as this very feminine city, very lacy, white, sparkling sort of city. And so we decided that we would create a landscape that was really about this stuff on the ground that was very hard, but also very light, very fine, very thin, very reflective, that could talk about this new boardwalk. And we presented this to Audi that we would do everything out of aluminum because Audi's chassis is made of aluminum. And the city didn't want anything that referenced Audi because of San Francisco, right? And so the aluminum gave us this sort of linchpin. And so we started then thinking about within a 6-foot area, because that's a parking stall, all we're doing is taking up the parking stall. And it's only 6 feet wide. So there's not much you can do. But most of the people on the street, they basically wanted the sidewalk increased. It's also a place where socially there's all kinds of people. There's your tourists from all over the world, and then there's your brothers who are begging. There's your people, the homeless young people who left the suburbs who have all kinds of issues. I mean, it's just one of these amazing streets, right? And so we thought about, wouldn't it be nice to just do a metal grate, and then when things come out of the metal grate and turn horizontal, it's for people. So you know where to go when something's horizontal. So you can go up to it and grab it, you can sit on it, you can lean on it. But when it's like that or like that, it's doing something else. And that's basically the genesis of this project. And it goes 2 blocks, and it launched back in August for Audi. And we have a whole sort of dictionary of furnishings that actually morph out of this rail. And this is the city street with the intervention there. So there's no more parked cars. And basically we took over the parking spaces here and put in these new aluminum. They call them parklets, but I just call them the sidewalk, right? But it's a place now where people gather. It's a place where the flora can flourish. It's a place where people can stop and meet. It creates eddies. It's also an edge. And now the skateboarders love this edge. Who would have thought? Skateboarders come down the hill with the trolley cars, pop an edge on the side, and then just keep going, never dealing with people. So it's actually really good for them, right? But on the other side, this is where most people sit. And this is H&M. And one of the sort of the sociological things that happens is all these guys that are sitting here are waiting on the gals in H&M, right? And those of you who've gone shopping know after a couple stores, you're looking for something outside, right? And it's funny, these kind of experiments happen, you know? We have Wi-Fi here. It's a place, again, where the kind of a branding, you know, almost goes invisible when it's full of people, you know, which, again, blew my mind that the more people there are on the street, the less you actually see the interventions. But then when there's less people, it has a presence. And the one thing that's interesting about getting rid of parking and having this use is now you can actually go up and lean and watch the trolley go by. And you see people doing this, giving high fives, but it's a different relationship with the movement. And we have our own PV, which allows us to do some lighting, not a lot, but enough to matter. This project was completed in 4 months. It was all fabricated within 15 miles of the site. Another project close to this is the ALB monument at San Francisco Embarcadero. A very simple design, which basically talks about the Spanish Civil War. And for me, this guy, Dave, who was 92 when this picture was taken, once the monument went up, Dave passed away the next month. But this was for a group of people who had really fought the American government to actually go over and help a country in time of need. And they formed these battalions. And in the Bay Area, it was one of the largest battalions. And for years, they fought to have their own monument. And Ann Chamberlain and myself worked with them over 10 years to actually create this monument. On one side, there's images etched in onyx. On the other side, text. And this idea that the stone, right, will live forever, and that these people will always be enmeshed in the stone. And I show this because it was a public sculpture. Larry Halprin worked on the Valancourt, and 5 years before, again, Larry's passed away, I asked him if, because you have to ask people are proprietary, could we put this on the backside of his piece? He said, sure, Walter. And sure enough, it works really well. It actually becomes a good complement because that fountain was designed for a freeway. And the freeway came down and it seems really weird. Now we brought the scale back down with this piece. If you ever get a chance out here, some of the writing on the wall is just really amazing because it's from poets, Paz, Langston Hughes, people who actually went over and actually participated. In New York, the Curtis 50 Cent Garden, again, going back to my early sort of critique of the community garden, this was an opportunity for me to actually, deal with those issues. And here, the project was through Bette Midler and the New York Restoration Gardens. And it was really to make a garden here for local residents. And I was really intrigued with this notion of garden art. And could these subsistence gardens actually be garden art? And so I sampled Sissinghurst's Garden of Love, which is in France, which had these heart-shaped parterres, which are located here. And then people can grow their vegetables within them. But this idea that within these neighborhoods, they don't need to be these kind of junky, let's build it ourselves kinds of things, but it could actually be something that people from the outside might actually come in and take a look at because there might be something else there. The people in the community, it was really about giving them something really performance-based. They needed water, so we actually have cisterns that hold the water down below so that they can basically do the practices of gardening. But it also allows for this other discussion about what the garden can be. And so just really quick, a very simple story. New York Restoration Garden sits in an office down the street from Madison Square Garden. So one day I go present my project, and these young hipsters, are upstairs working. They're really intense. It's like, yeah, man, Walter, did you ever heard of Gun It? I'm like, you mean gun your car? No. There's this nonprofit downstairs called Gun It. We're thinking going down there, man. I saw all these hip hop guys. Can we talk to them? I'm like, I don't know of any Gun It, right? Gun It turns out to be 50 Cent, and it's not Gun It, it's G Unit, right? That's where the cultural thing comes up. But they went down, they got corrected on their Gun It, and they found out that it was actually 50 Cent and the G Unit Foundation. And the G Unit Foundation then gave about $300,000 to build this garden, which again, is aligning with the water, if you guys know 50, right? So he's into health and this notion of food and water. It makes a strong, sort of case for this person who is an entrepreneur, who's trying to brand himself. And so the garden, in a way, for me then, became this extension, right, of these two individuals. But also on opening day, it blew my mind. I've never seen so many young kids go to a garden and be happy. And they showed up, I pull up, I wrote on the window, oh, it's just you, where's 50? Right, and of course they came there for 50. And every time he comes to the garden, there are these, turnouts. And so now it's a place where people go and they associate with him, and therefore people want to be there, particularly the kids who are at risk, who the garden is built for. So it has a way of coming around, and this was taken earlier in the summer. He holds his annual cancer drives and different things there. And people come and they stay, and that's a great thing. Okay, I think this is the last project. I know you guys are getting antsy. And this last project kind of brings everything together. One, why would Walter Hood be in Jackson, Wyoming? Right? And why would he be doing a sculpture and wildlife art terrace trail, right? Who's been to Jackson, Wyoming? It's an amazing landscape, right? And my first time going to Jackson, it's like, you can't do anything here. There's just no way. Glacier came through, created this moraine, can't do anything. Architecture looks stupid there. Because you're looking up, you got the Tetons, this amazing landscape. Then it snows and everything goes away. But it has this power to it. And we were working on a previous project, the Performing Arts Center, and hopefully that's coming back. But my first sort of critique was you had this really beautiful site. And Kurt Fentress, who I know very well, architect, built this wildlife museum in that middle shot. He created this shelf. And on the shelf, they placed this museum. And when you're coming into town, you're going along that moraine, it sits up on the hill. Now, the donor evidently wanted a Scottish ruin, right? And Kurt gave him a Scottish ruin, which means you go right by the ruin because it blends in with the landscape. It's made of this big rock. And so our sort of big piece was, how do we get people, one, to come to this museum that sits up on this shelf? How do we change the museum's mind of having a building and then a half-mile stretch of parking up on that shoulder? So when you first go up that hill, you arrive in a parking lot. You can walk from one end to the other. This is in the middle of Jackson. Well, it's not even in Jackson. It's in the moraine. It's all parking. And can we get them to think less about this road, which this is a major tourist area, where hundreds of thousands of people are coming through in the summer, and to get people to think about that landscape experience. So we had the opportunity to design a sculpture terrace. When we first got the project, I said, let's not say trail, and I suggested that we take half the parking away, and that we take the parking away that's at the edge. Because when you go there, you're standing in a parking lot, so let's get rid of the parking at the edge and give people a terrace so they can go from one end of this terrace to the other and experience that landscape. That's what the landscape looked like. So you're coming in. This is like a Donald Judd. And every year, they put new blacktop down. So I was there the day after, and it was like black. And in the summer, it is so hot, the asphalt is popping. And you're just sitting there going, are you guys crazy? And so we started talking about getting rid of the parking, and they're like, we can't get rid of the parking. And I've never been there when the parking lot's been full, but they kept coming back with the days, right? There are these 2 days, right? So as we went 5 years later through the project, we actually talked about, can we give visitors a new experience? And this experience would be based on coming up, and there's the entry. You would drive up, you would drop someone off right in the front of the museum. So it's a suburban experience that you have. And we were suggesting to them, can we have a different experience than coming up and just arriving at a building on blacktop? And look at the landscape in the back. It's this amazing, marmots are everywhere. Rocks are constantly falling down the hill. And the sculpture looks like that. And so we suggested, can you come in from the backside, come around, and then look at a place for people on the inside, and then look out, no parking, and people are out at an edge. So that was the basic premise. We're under construction now. This is one place you can get to, and there's no parking. So you're literally out on the edge of the world. And the parking's like right here. So we basically created this sectional sort of landscape where I come from the parking, this goes down 4 feet, the road down below gets taken away. This is a set of stairs going down. The scale of this beam that's a 12-foot long piece of stone. I mean, that's the other beautiful thing about Jackson. You can just get big stuff, right? And getting that big stuff allows you then to carve and caress the landscape in a very different way so that the auto goes away, and when you're up on this piece, you just get a completely different experience. So when we started doing this, the director was like, wow, I see it. And so I would have to go up there and take people around the parking lot to show them, right? And then finally one day the director goes, get rid of the parking, right? But this is after many chances. And really getting people in space really does matter. And this project should be done, this is the entry now, where you can actually have amphitheaters and you can have sort of classes and things. There are trails that take you out away from the building. But this is that new entry sequence. You don't get dropped off in the front, you come around the back and move this way, and people have an unimpeded sort of view of that amazing moraine. And the landscape just comes right up to you. And once you remove that road, it's just amazing. So I hope tonight I've sort of given you some insight into hood design as a cultural practice, and I thank you so much for coming out. Sure. Any questions? No. Thanks, Mark. It's like, eh. Was there someone? No? What are we doing? Yes, ma'am.
I was struck again, looking at your work, how different the projects look, how they appear. So the
Okay.
palettes, and it just strikes me how they're conceptually driven. What you did in the Tetons versus the park, the water park.
Right.
before that. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because we tend to associate a practice
Right.
with this sensibility of appearance.
Right.
And it's really interesting to me that I don't necessarily draw that line through yours.
That's a really good question. And you know, having a practice for 20 years, you can look back, and that's probably the first time. But I would have to say, after working on the De Young Museum with Herzog and Demlong, it was very interesting how European architects worked conceptually. And I would have to say I was really jealous that I didn't understand that practice, that way of working, because I didn't, you know, we just don't work that way. Meaning, Pierre would come into a room and a donor would say, show me an elevation. Don't have it. Don't know. The floor plan is done, everything's done. Don't know what it looks like. Straight face. And it's cooking. Still asking questions about it. And I was really intrigued by that. I mean, how is that possible that you can get to Z and somewhere at M, you're somewhere off in the forest, you know? And again, a lot of that comes back through, for me, this notion of speculation and practice, or practice and speculation, and this notion of being confident that you're going to get back, and that you can play all day in the sandlot, but you got to get back and make a project. And that's something that I relish these days, and I make sure in the process that we're not what I call being lazy, as looking at the last project and bringing that forward. But there's something about making CD drawings at the end and asking questions along the way. You know you're going to have that package, but the questions are different questions. And you know, it's something that hurts you and helps you, because people want to somehow categorize your work in some way. And I get that question all the time. What do you do? Oh, I understand you. Oh, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. But it makes the work more curious, I think. And the last thing to add to that, it allows you to sort of constantly grow and not get stuck in a kind of sort of a singular view of things. So. Yes, ma'am.
I have to ask, would you see your work more as creation or as discovery?
Both. Both. I mean, for me, out of discovery, something is created. I mean, at each site, there is something. I mean, at every project, I can probably tell you of a discovery. Even at Mitch's, you know, at the place with the little residential thing, there's always, you know, that time when something goes off, or that you note something, and that can feed something else, the creative process. And I think it's a good sort of tail end of the previous question. You know, this notion of when to act, right? When to act on something, I don't want to use the term new, but when to act and going in a different direction, right? Any others? Yes, ma'am. Right. Well, I think it's place. I mean, for me, I mean, really, the photos came out of the stained glass windows of the Church of the Moors next door. You know, I mean, Jackson, the big stuff. I mean, and I think it's place. I mean, I think if you look hard enough, there are these touchstones, right? These things that you can find that are culturally relevant. And I use the term culture not as just thinking about individuals who live in a place, but it's that experience of that place in time. You know, there are certain things, you know. Again, it's like going to Jackson and seeing that people drive everywhere. Blows my mind. You know, and they then drive to the Tetons to put the backpack on. And that's because they don't see the world around them. And so, you know, at the museum now, people, it's funny, the lunchtime people are out there walking, you know? Everyone who works in the museum now walk back. I mean, it's kind of crazy. They're just walking back and forth. But they're not in their cars. So it's place, I would say, more than anything. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Thank you. From a material standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like plant life that has
Yeah.
time. But some of them seem like they're
Right. Well, yes and no. Landscape, the beautiful thing about landscape is it gets better in time. Well, it should get better in time, put it that way. And it's really hard in landscape to sort of understand where you are at a particular moment. The DeYoung Museum is a good example. It's been 7 years now. It's so verdant at this point that I could never have imagined it. You know, we planted some dinosaur ears in the children's garden, which is this gunnera. And I've seen gunnera like this. The gunnera's like that. I mean, but it does something completely different. The Powell Street project, I have no idea what it's going to look like in 5 years. Right? That's the aluminum landscape. I mean, I don't have a clue, you know. Hopefully it'll look good. But I don't have a clue how it might transform. The city might add some stuff, you know, I mean, so that's a different sort of transformation versus a garden versus a park. And I think in landscape, each kind of context has a different sort of set of transformers to a certain degree. So, but some projects, I mean, the installations are the only ones that I do and you walk away from because they're done. The other projects, people keep calling you. You know, I mean, the landscape project is like, you've done it and they're your client for life. I didn't know that. You know, we did a project 15 years ago and I still, every spring, Walter, the trees are blooming. And you're like, what? You know, but they want me to come out and see the trees bloom with them. So it is a different relationship. So.